The NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery is an intimate museum space in a university setting. At the Art Gallery, we present curated exhibitions of art and culture of local relevance and international significance. We also invite you to explore our exhibitions in the project space and around campus, as well as our activities both online and in our reading room.
The reading room, located next to the Art Gallery. It's a space all communities can utilize and learn more about a wide variety of different topics.
The project space is the NYU Art Gallery's auxiliary venue to nurture young emerging artists and curators.
We support a number of other art projects and activities beyond our exhibition spaces. We care for the permanent art installations on campus, like Hassan Sharif's Copper Wire, which welcomes guests to NYU AD.
We aim to create an atmosphere where everyone feels encouraged to share their thoughts and experiences.
We hope that you will visit us online and in person to discover our exhibitions, events, and publications. We look forward to welcoming you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the Arts Chat, Collaborating Across Cultures. My name is Sebastian Grube, and I am the Community Engagement and Marketing Officer at the NYU Abu Dhabi Art Gallery. The Arts Chat is a series of discussions presented in partnership with the Arts Center at NYU Abu Dhabi and the Career Development Center. It is also part of the Arts Center's Off the Stage series, presented by Mubadala, and it is in line with the UAE's commitment to the International Year of Creative Economies for Sustainable Development. You can learn more about other events organized by the Art Center and the Art Gallery through our respective newsletters and websites. The Arts Chat series aims to combine perspectives from the visual and performing arts by inviting leaders from the respective fields. And with that in mind, I want to thank and welcome our panelists, Karishma Baghani, Abhishek Majumdar, Mahnaz Fancy, and Meklit Hadero. Our moderator tonight is NYU AD double major in theater and social research and public policy, Anushka Upadhyaya. We will have a Q&A session with the panel at the end of the conversation, so feel free to post your questions in the chat. Arts chats are recorded for social media and internal archiving purposes. And I will now hand over to Anushka to get our conversation started.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, and welcome to everybody. I'd like to invite all the panelists to turn on their cameras, and then we'll get our conversation started. Hello, so good to see all of you again. Before we go into our actual conversation, why don't we go around and just briefly introduce ourselves? Abhishek, would you like to start?
Hi, thank you, Anushka. I'm Abhishek Majumdar. I'm a playwright and theater director, and I also am a professor at NYU Abu Dhabi.
I'm actually in Abhishek's capstone class. Karishma, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Good morning for those tuning in not from the UAE or those regions. My name is Karishma Baghani. I am a producer and a director. I'm currently pursuing my PhD in theater and performance studies at Stanford University, an alumni of the NYU Tisch School of the Arts, and I'm very excited to be on this panel.
Great, thank you so much. Mahnaz?
Hi, sorry, unmuted now. Mahnaz Fancy. 20 years of founding and running organizations for cultural exchange in the US and 5 years in the UAE, currently with the Sharjah Architecture Triennial.
Thank you so much. And lastly, Meklit.
Hey everyone, I'm Meklit Hadero. It's really good to be here with you today. I'm a singer-songwriter and composer from Ethiopia, living in the United States for most of my life. I am an Ethio jazz singer-songwriter and composer, and also the chief of program at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco, as well as the founder and host and co-producer of Movement, a podcast and live show telling stories of global migration and music. Nice to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much. Why don't we jump right into the questions? So my first question to all of you is, how does collaborating across cultures play into your art form or your creativity? And how has it sort of lended itself, how have cultures lended itself to your contribution to art? And why don't we start with Karishma?
That's a very great and a very loaded question. I think we need a whole other panel to talk about that. But I'll be brief and talk a little bit about my ethos in terms of my work as a producer. A lot of my work is really focused on bringing new African voices to the front stages in performance for an African and an international audience. And by that, I mean, whether it's in a directing capacity of directing new works or in a producing capacity of supporting the creation of a platform that can facilitate this. This is where, my work sort of exists. And also there's the space for new African scholarship. And as I've been in the field, after having graduated and still also kept my academic interests at hand, noticed that we cannot exist in a cocoon, or we cannot exist just as the African continent or just as Kenyan artists focusing on a specific piece of work. So for me, the value of these kind of transnational collaborations is that we are able to share with the world what we have to offer and what we've been doing for generations and decades in terms of our practice that is new and innovative, and different really from any other culture. And in return, we're able to learn from various design practices and various other practices from other cultures that we can apply within our context. So for me, the value of these kind of transnational collaboration is meeting our colleagues at the same level and being able to be in a space of exchange where their contributions help us make our work richer and vice versa.
That is so enriching of an answer, even in just a few minutes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate what you say, especially about we're not in a cocoon, we're never in a cocoon. And especially in this panel today, I feel like everybody having lived all around the world has so much to say about what it really means to be collaborating across spaces. Would anybody like to add to what collaboration means to them? Yeah, Abhishek, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to this by saying that I think a lot of collaboration is really about diversity, and that's key to the process and learning within a collaboration, which is to say that other than, of course, this very important aspect that Karishma brought about in terms of transnational collaboration, there is also kind of socio-political, socio-economic diversity, which I think many organizations are consciously thinking about, and that also affects the nature of collaboration. And I think the learnings that a company like the various companies that I work with, they grow because of diversities of all kinds, whether it is looking at sexuality, gender, economic diversity, and of course, internationalism. I think so. All of these things are part of a collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Mahnaz, you wanted to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I love what Abhishek and Karishma just said. And I just wanted to add one thing, which is that, in my line of work, I'm more on the administrative side. So it's setting up and establishing a platform that allows for this kind of cross-cultural exchange and dialogue that then feeds a creative process. But it's also an act of translation, and a translation across disciplines. And to me, that's always been a kind of valuable part of it, because how I would talk about it in a kind of academic speak, or in my activist moments, speaking with policymakers, the way they would speak about it. When we work with artists, there is a different kind of language that is formed, that is more open and more fluid and more able to do the work of crossing across these lines of divide, whether they be disciplinary or cultural or national specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
I
I see you trying to jump in. Go ahead.
only because, well, okay, first of all, it was a great question. And I also just want to say that to my fellow panelists, like, oh, you all are amazing. Like, this is such a pleasure to be in dialogue with you. But I just want, because there is so much to say about this question, but what's coming to me right now is this, it's a sort of fundamental principle that interconnectedness is the only way we're going to face the challenges of the 21st century, which are entirely new, because our challenges are interconnected. Therefore, our solutions must be interconnected. And collaboration is one way, especially cross-cultural collaboration. And there's a particular way that artists and creative practice can allow us to feel our way into, as well as work our way into, an understanding of what interconnectedness might look like as a structure. And so it's actually a very powerful formation of a pathway that is about the way that our frameworks of thinking about the world can shift, but have it be in a way that's not just about your head, but like gets into your body, and you have an understanding of it that means something to you as a space in your life, and that can be shared with folks from a place where you feel into your common humanity. So it's really, really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. It really reminds me of this idea that Karishma brought up in our last conversation about how in her work in particular in East Africa, she's looking at how do you create in spite and despite of this access, this barrier to access, or this lack of resources that we have. So I want to bring that layer into our conversation also about many of us have been working in spaces mostly in, or are rooted in context of the global South. And so as we are navigating, decolonizing our own understandings of art, how have you navigated your spaces of providing equity, providing access, removing some barriers that make it so hard for us to create? I know that's a little bit wordy, but whatever comes to your head, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Karishma, since you inspired this, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another very loaded question, right? Because I think it brings this question of power play and dynamics, or power dynamics, into the front and center of the conversation, and that sort of unfolds in a lot of different capacities, in practical work as well. Whether it's producing or looking at issues of simple things like funding, or one of the challenges that we had to think about as we were working on figuring out the Theatre for One project over the last few months is whether we would simply be able to do it because we just have too many power cuts back home. How will we manage? Or the cost of internet is very expensive. How do we make it happen despite these challenges? I will say that I think there's no one answer, and it is a working solution. I don't think we can come up with a theory to say this is the correct way to have South-South collaborations, or to have collaborations with countries that we had former colonial relationships with. But for me, what is at the center of my practice is ensuring that whatever we are bringing to the table is seen and met at an equal level. Meaning, if I'm coming with 10 professionals, I expect that those 10 professionals are going to be treated in the same way that the 10 professionals from Britain or from another country, will be treated. Whether that, that includes questions of funding, that includes questions of fees, and in terms of an access perspective, if things like data and transport are needed, that's something that we need to make sure, is available. I did mention something earlier about South-South collaborations, and I find myself very interested in that kind of work as well, because I feel that, especially in countries like Kenya, we are still very tied to these former neo-colonial relationships that we've had, right? So our funding comes from diplomats and embassies, which is great, and it's wonderful that we do have that resource, but it's restrictive in many ways. So I'm finding that collaborations with other global South countries, even though the financial resources might not always match up, has been a wonderful way to think about sustainable creative economy, right? How do I partner with the festival in Uganda and bring my work there, as opposed to thinking about going right to New York first? How can we build out the economy in our region first and support each other's work? Because the festivals are always looking for work. We have work to share. So why not start with that first, and then think about how that as a lump sum can be transported or shifted or tour, around the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm thinking perhaps we should go to Mahnaz now, just because you also mentioned how you go at it from an administrative perspective. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think that the question of creating a sense of parody is so important, but can be handled in so many ways. And I think it's important to understand the realization that comes from shifting from being in the US and being able to access those kinds of fundings, and then coming here and working with a wider regional Arab, MENA, MENASA kind of community, and the different kinds of funding and what those look like. And in the end, every funder, whether they're an individual or a government or an embassy, has a certain amount of interest in the end product. And we all have to kind of make peace with how we handle that, and how we make peace of it while not sacrificing the integrity of the creative practitioners and what they want to create, are ways of finding value in kind of what they bring in kind, right? I mean, oftentimes it is a space. Oftentimes it is a skill set. The collaboration part of it is about understanding, I mean, as Karishma said in a perfect way, everybody coming to the table at an equal level, right? And you bring something to the table, there is dignity in that, but there's also nothing wrong with getting funding as long as everybody is cognizant and able to talk about the strings that come with it, and they're negotiated. And this is how we carry on. We do live in a world that is about historical traces of all kinds of uneven power relationships. And that's something that we cannot pretend away. But it also feeds into our creative work and can be addressed in really interesting ways that don't always have to be, cataclysmic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Abhishek and Meklit, would you like to add anything in terms of the perspective of creating in an atmosphere like this?
Thank you. What I wanted to add a couple of things, and which is to say, well, two things. One, though I've worked, particularly when I was working with the Nile Project, very deeply across East Africa, the 11 countries of the Nile Basin, but also working now in San Francisco at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, I want to really just say that there are equity issues and challenges of colonial history and how we manage and deal with colonial history that are also happening in the US in a different way. And I just want to say that it's been a really interesting, there's a really interesting perspective that I've learned recently from some of my Native American community members, this idea that for, and this is because, when you're working in San Francisco, you are on Native American land, right? And there's, we do land acknowledgements to acknowledge that, and many of the arts and culture world will start every performance with a land acknowledgement saying we are on indigenous land. But going further than that, many of the indigenous communities are saying now, that decolonization from their perspective is about land rematriation, that it's not a metaphor. So I just wanted to say that it's even working in the United States, there are still very different ways that we have to acknowledge that. And at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, we're really trying to understand how, as an institution, and from my role, as Mahnaz was saying, from an administrative perspective, how we deal with that as an arts institution. And so we're starting to work with the communities there to really understand what that means. So that's a whole other thing, but I just wanted to put that out there because it's something I've been learning a lot about in the last 2 years of my role at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. In terms of my perspective working in the Nile Basin, one thing that was really important to me, as Mahnaz was saying, and Karishma was saying about working from an equal perspective, one thing that was really important to me when we were very early on in the project was this idea that so often when it comes to this idea of, modernizing our traditional music, another loaded phrase, right? Like, we don't have to get into that, but I'll just say the point is, a lot of times people would see modernization as meaning bringing in Western instruments or Western, influences. But from the Nile Project perspective, we were really thinking about defining what that means for ourselves from an inter-African collaboration perspective, and putting that on as a platform by which we were saying, this is what contemporary is, and this is how evolutions of culture can be defined for ourselves in terms of our region and what really is important to us and how we feel it as artists, and how that can have impact beyond just the music. So I just wanted to add those two perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That just really, I'm taking a moment to process that almost. That was very heavy. I really appreciate it though. Abhishek, before we go to you, I also want to add this layer of language involved. Like Meklit already said, in terms of acknowledging the decolonizing act of creating theater, there's also a lot of language barriers that we face. And as someone who creates in different languages, how has your experience been?
Yeah, it's really phenomenal to add anything to this panel. Everything that is being said, I'm also registering. I'm going, yes, yeah, of course, that. So great. I think, the first thing I want to say is that I find increasingly that it's very important for people like me who practice a lot of my practice is in South Asia, is to not define ourselves in the terms of the West. Right? So, say for example, if I work in Pashto, it would be a Pakistani language, and I'm an Indian. But actually the roots going in from Urdu to Pashto to Hindi has nothing to do with India or Pakistan. Mm-hmm. The category of Pashto and Urdu goes way before the even imagination of India and Pakistan, let alone the formation of India and Pakistan. So sometimes I find that, questions of identity that are posed in Western academia, Western programming are really the hegemonic discourse. In order to counter colonization, what we are given now is another set of values which you have to adhere to, which is ahistorical. So I think the one important thing about dealing with language is to deny that ahistorical categorization of self. The second thing is that what can one do with the language, which is another thing. that because of the effects of colonization, many people in the world have learned English or learned French or whatever, but fewer people have learned all these other 1 million languages of the world. Uh, Unfortunately, what has happened is that there is a kind of international festivalization of language, which is that you can argue in English, you can argue in French, but you can be spiritual in Hindi. You can talk to God in Yoruba. You can think about your ancestors in Tamil, as if there is no argument in these languages. Because that's very easy, right? That fits into a frame. So I think with language, both in its form and its content, it is hard, but it's also very important to reclaim the dialectical history of your own, of not one's own language, what is one's own language, but the languages that one has, as opposed to, viewing again that in the frame of what is allowed and what is not allowed in which language. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think what I'm learning from all of you, firstly, thank you so much, but also is how important reframing is. I wanted to take a step back and sort of ask about, I don't know if this is a step back, but maybe a more practical dive into this theoretical talk we're having right now. What are some challenges you've had on the ground while working on reframing? And reframing can obviously mean different things for your different works. But I just wanted to push that out there. And why don't we start with Meklit?
I'm sorry, can you ask the question one more time?
Yes, sorry. I tend to do this a lot where I get very wordy. Just what are some challenges that you faced while creating art, while also trying to reframe cultures?
Yeah, there's one challenge that I run into, and I'm gonna speak personally for a moment as a songwriter. But I have this what Abhishek just said. I just have to say one really quick thing about it, which is only once I saw a map of the world where each country was, the label on each country was the name that it called itself. And in the language, and in the script, its own script, and the name that it called itself. And it was translated into Roman letters in the English, so you could read it in English. So that itself is like a commentary also. But that map never left me, and I don't know how to find it. It was on the wall of a hostel that I saw when I was 21 years old. It was just so beautiful though. But I feel that there's something in that. And then in terms of some of the challenges. Now I'm going to speak as a songwriter. One thing that I find as a challenge, and this is something that I was very inspired by Toni Morrison, the late Toni Morrison, Nobel laureate writer and novelist. She spoke about the way that when you are working across cultures, how much do you explain yourself? How much do you explain, this is, I just did the thing, and now I have to tell you about the thing so you understand the thing, and you're probably telling about it in English because that's, as Abhishek was saying. So, or do you just do the thing and talk, and say that it itself, the creative piece itself is enough, and to find your way in, then the other, maybe there's a community that needs to know something else, but are you the person to say it? Like, who are you talking to? Are you speaking to your own cultural, communities? Are you speaking broadly? And I really struggle with this. Like, I really, really, really struggle, because what Toni Morrison was saying was that when you're explaining assuming that your audience is, from the United States or from England, or it's these large colonial power. But also sometimes I say to myself, well, but don't I want my homies from Vietnam to understand? Like it's that. So what is it? Like, how much do you explain? I really, really struggle with this. Do you do the thing and just let the thing be itself, the song, the melody, the rhythm, Or do you say what you're doing so that there's more of a pathway in, and who are you inviting in when you say that? And, so this is something that I really struggle with a lot. And that's a challenge personally that I yes.
Mahnaz, yes, go ahead.
I actually been thinking about this since I gave my last answer, but we cannot forget that the other collaborator in our process is the audience, right? And they participate and contribute to the end product and its impact in a massive way. So when I'm thinking as a curator, producer, I'm thinking certain things. When I'm thinking as the administrator, I actually think very hard about getting different audiences in front of whatever performance, talk, and anything, so that this tendency to keep from getting polemical, where we use language that kind of reduces the emotional impact of the creative process and end product, and turns it into the thing of the mind. I mean, I'm actually replying exactly to you, Meklit. I think that we feel that we need to translate literally, and instead we need to trust that the very fact of art making and putting in front of an audience is the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, especially what you say about the audience being a part of your collaboration has me thinking about how have your processes changed in the past year or so, once we've gone online and now slowly, hopefully moving back in person. I think the way we think of who is the audience, how do we reach the audience has significantly changed. And I would love to hear how that process has been for you. And why don't we start with Karishma?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, before I sort of attempt to address what you've just asked, I just want to recognize Meklit and Mahnaz and Abhishek, you've raised some really important and interesting questions that I also, I think from a producing perspective here, struggle with of, who are we performing for? How much of it is ours? How much is collaborative? And it brings up a lot of interesting conversations and discussions. And I think it really is about the intentionality. So it's okay, if I'm going to do this performance in English, I'm doing it because I know that I'm doing it for an audience that needs it for this. And that will not compromise the artistic quality of my work. So that's just something that came up for me as you were speaking. I'll speak a little bit more specifically about the Theatre for One experience, just as you've asked about, with these new times that we are living in. Before Bill and I, met at PACE, which is where this whole relationship began. PACE is the Pan-African Creative Exchange. For those that don't know about it, it's a biannual presentation platform in South Africa that convenes artists from all around the world to see new works from the African continent. It was virtual, and so Bill and I connected there. But before we did, I was really, I'm a grandma when it comes to technology. I'm such a live theater person. I need to be able to go into a space. And so I was very confused about how I personally would exist in this new world of everything is happening on Zoom. How is this going to work for our sector? Data is so expensive. People can barely log on. Power cuts are happening. So I thought, this is the death of the industry here for us. I mean, theater is not going to exist at all. Not that it exists on its own anyway. It's very interdisciplinary here, to start with. But I was very confused about what the next step is. So for me, having embarked on this process of supporting the production for Theatre for One, which has its own platform and its own server that is routed through Germany or Singapore, first of all, it was literally like reading binary for me because it's just not my language. So it was a personal challenge to adjust to this, to introducing this new technological form into the sector, as much as it was for me to personally even understand it as an artist in my own right. But I think it's really, now having closed our performances yesterday, it's really, and looking at it from the other side in retrospect, it's really opened up the possibilities for what the theatrical landscape could look like. I've always talked about how we are so multidisciplinary and we're not just an actor, or we're not just a director, or we're not actor for the theater here. in Kenya, everybody is doing everything at the same time. And that's what makes our work what it is. So this introduction of this kind of technology has, I think, opened up a new door. And if we can figure out some of the back end administrative challenges, and if we can have the support like we did with the Art Center in making those challenges finding a solution to these challenges, then it doesn't compromise the quality of the work and actually really expands our horizons.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you on how it's opened so many doors. Even as a student right now doing online classes, in a way, it definitely has deprived me of, that sense of physical community. But at the same time, I'm accessing all of you. We're getting to have this conversation. And so definitely there's this idea that so much that was perhaps not possible in the same way is now possible. Abhishek, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things. I think the first point I want to say is that I think the theatre community, at least in many places, declared too soon that the internet was the new theatre. And it's a kind of red signal for me that if we truly believe that all our audiences that we had are on the internet, it means that we were doing something wrong as theatre makers. Because clearly, like where I work, most of my audiences are not people who have, access to the computer. They are in places where, that's not the given. But because we think also of theatre as something which unfortunately is slightly cut off from common, populations, and this has been a struggle even before the pandemic. Theatre makers have been trying to challenge this thing. Theatres have been trying to open up spaces to reach out to communities and not be insular. On one hand, this internet revolution of putting on digital work, it has helped us reach many more people in many countries, but it has also created this cocoon within our communities of feeling that we have reached lots of people, but we have actually removed ourselves from various people in our own communities. That's one. The second thing I want to say is about what is modernity in any art, right? It's a big question in dance and music and everything. So now when we look at internet theatre, what is modernity? Is it the presence of multiple pages, participation with audience, and how easy or how difficult is it going to get? The reason why I'm saying this is that I suspect technological modernity might be inversely proportional to creative modernity in theatre making. Like if you see one of the biggest, most successful businesses during the lockdown in India was online gambling. Because people who didn't have anything to eat had just 7 rupees for a day and they could play around for 1 rupee. And it's the tragedy of capitalism, right? You have money only that much that you can survive on that 1 rupee, but you don't have money to get a meal. But online gambling places, they flourished like nobody's business during this time. They became sort of millionaires in India overnight because of common people's money of people who were not able to buy food. Which brings me to this thing that are we able to create theatre that is accessible to somebody who does not have high bandwidth, who doesn't know how to click many things, who doesn't read English on the screen? I think those are all modern questions in creation as well, which seem like the opposite of what technological modernity is aiming at.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It comes back to this idea that we've been juggling in this conversation already about how do you include equity, how do you include parity and access for everybody. Why don't we bring that question to all of you? And Meklit, what do you think about that? How do we go about this even? Where do we begin?
Well, I'm starting to get to know you through your questions, which are all, as Karishma was saying, panels in themselves. I think that, the first way that we do it is by listening. By listening to what communities really want and need. And that this is something that can be very, very challenging institutionally. And again, I can, speaking from both a place where I've had many years as a arts administrator, as well as many years as a creative person and songwriter and organizer. For me, listening to people and what they truly need is at the heart of both of those things. And I think that also means that, decision making becomes something that's opened up. And this is something that we're really experimenting with at YBCA, at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, in all kinds of ways. And, and again, I'm just going to speak from the US perspective for just a moment. And then I'll speak about movement very briefly. But I'm just going to give an example. So one of the ways that we've been thinking about how do you really do this at YBCA is actually how do you get entirely out of the way of power and decision making. So especially being an institution that does have the ability to get resources, how do you then not be the entirely the decider of how those resources are distributed? And one way that we did that at YBCA was by creating what's called the Artist-Led Giving Circle. And so we were able to get a grant from Start Small, which is Jack Dorsey's money from Square. Jack Dorsey was the founder of Square and also of Twitter, and he gave us a grant. And we turned around and gave $250,000, which to a group of Black, Indigenous, and artists of color who've been working in community settings around the health and well-being of their communities around the country, and said, okay, it's yours. What do you want to do with it? And instead of spending that money or deciding what the program was, we actually just turned it over to them and said, it's up to you, you figure it out. And we supported them with facilitation, with technical assistance, with the trainings that they asked for. It was actually their money and their resources, and we were entirely in a space of support. And then another way that we did that is we're currently giving a grant for convenings for artists to build their capacity in service of their communities. And the grants are decided by the people who apply themselves. Now, this is that the people who apply get to decide who gets the funding. Now, these are still, there's still a lot of equity questions, so I don't want to say that we solved it. For example, who are the people who've been able to create the organizations or do the, years of work that it takes to build the trust that an organization can say, here, take it, you decide. There are very many, many layers, but the point that I'm trying to make is that as an institution, YBCA is experimenting with how equity can be us getting out of the way and letting community-led voices, especially communities of color, indigenous communities, make the decisions about the resources that they need in their communities, particularly around creative practice impacting well-being. So that's one way. And then but in terms of movement and the project around telling stories of global migration through music, this is literally about voices that have about myself and my practice of being a person who sees themselves as making migration music, saying it can't, for me, it's never just about me as an artist. It's always about making space for other artists. And so my own practice is, how do I get out of the way and make platforms for others' voices to reach communities that they want to reach and that they tell us that they want to reach? And how do we do collaborative storytelling so that they're the ones determining how their story is told, where we're in a support role for them? So those are some kind of personal experiences that I've had with that. But it's a really complicated question. And it's, as we say, legacy work. It's like lifelong work. These are very deep, entrenched issues. So we have a lot to do around this question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It really resonates. Like you said, I feel like it is something that we can't really come to a solution for in one panel, but also taking your idea of creating space for people. We've gotten a lot of audience questions, and I want to move to that now because the questions are absolutely amazing. So we have one anonymous question that says, how do you decide if a certain collaboration is worth pursuing or is meaningful? Because from my personal experience, working across cultures can lead to having many differences and disagreements. Why don't we let Abhishek answer that?
Yeah, I'll try. I think, the one thing that I want to say is that collaboration is not a choice. It's a given, like there will be someone else one is working with. And like Mahnaz said beautifully, we should remember that the audience or the community is the other, like even if I have gotten up, made the show,
Your internet is
but even the audience doesn't end.
Abhishek, we're losing you.
But in order to pursue,
Hello? Okay, I think he's having some technical difficulties. Why don't we let Mahnaz take that question?
hello, can you hear me?
Oh, Abhishek is back.
Yeah.
Why don't we circle back to you after Mahnaz has answered?
I think I've lost the question at this point because I've gotten transported into everybody's answer. But I'm going to tell you briefly what I've been thinking about. I mean, I think what's the point of collaboration if not to confront difference? That's the whole point of it. And as long as there is an agreement in the what you are doing and why you are doing it, the how differences can be negotiated. And this is the difficult part of it. I mean, this is the producer, curator kind of role where, in a way, it's about setting up the rules of engagement for a collaboration, because the creative process can be incredibly fruitful, but also a passionate one that we all feel so personally invested in. And, God forbid, we're actually talking about our own culture or in our history, it becomes even more invested. How do we go about doing this ultimate act of vulnerability in a way, right? But it's also an act of generosity at the same time. And think of collaboration in that way. I'm getting cheesier by the minute, I'm sorry.
No, it's all called for, honestly. Everything still resonates. So thank you. I'm going to read another question that Bill has asked. The early part of the conversation focused on the important conceptual values and challenges of cross-cultural collaboration, and all of you have deep experience working within this sphere. I'm curious whether there are certain strategies in your practice which have proven successful in terms of creating equitable exchange and collaboration, or finding commonalities that doesn't erase the distinctive experiences and traditions of the participants. And this was sort of answered by Meklit. So Bill again asks, building on that and Meklit's current answer, are there specific listening practices? And why don't we begin with Karishma and then we can go around.
That's a really great question. I think active listening is something that comes up to me as the immediate response to that. Everybody is going to walk in, for me, any sort of collaboration really is like a marriage, right? With the prenup. You walk in and you're saying, this is what I need. And one of my mentors, when I was just starting off in producing, Roberta Levito, who's a dear friend and a mentor, said to me, Karishma, you must always lead with the need, like lead with what you want. Be very specific, but at the same time, allow for space for the other person to tell you what they need. It's like a marriage, right? And so for me, being an active listener, and oftentimes it's something as simple as saying, why don't you start with telling me what you want? And then I'll tell you what we can provide and where I am at in terms of, whether or not that's possible within my capacities or within the resources that I can give. So sometimes just giving priority to the other person to let them start with what they're hoping for, especially if they're the ones that have approached you with the desire to collaborate, I feel always sets a good foundation for any new relationship, any new professional relationship. And then you can, of course, build off of that and say, listen, this is what I feel comfortable with. I'm not sure that I'm able to provide this, but I can definitely, try and make it work. Also, listening not to respond, but listening to actually take in what the other person is trying to say and what their intentionality is behind the work they want to do is something I hold near and dear in my personal and my professional life. And I feel that it's what establishes trust for a longer term relationship. So that's what I would say.
Very beautifully put. Thank you so much. There's also one other question that I want to bring to the table before we move on to someone else. Affirmation of identity is a very important part of art created by oppressed or minority cultural groups. How do you navigate maintaining identity when working with other cultures that may not share your struggles? And why don't we go to Meklit for this?
I am compelled to say something in response to an earlier question, which also relates to this question, which is that what I'm learning, and I admit it took me like 10 years to learn this, so some learnings come slow, is that one thing that is starting to work for me is that like, how do you decide what you're going to do when you run into conflict before conflict happens? And as you enter into the collaboration, you say, we are going to touch things that are near and dear to my being, my very core. And the point of this collaboration is that the core of us may be in a conversation so that others may reach into what is deepest in them. Mahnaz, I heard you about the getting cheesier and cheesier. I just did it too. We're on the same page, homegirl. But the point is that if you can say, okay, this probably means that we're going to have some friction. Now, how are we going to handle that when it comes up? Okay, we have these active listening practices, like Karishma said. When we start to feel the friction, we're going to really listen to each other. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you decide before it happens, before you're triggered, and then you know what to do when you're in that process. And so you can go to the other person and say, I feel I'm not being heard as a person who is coming from a marginalized identity. And part of the point is that this identity finds space. How do we do that with each other? And you say, and you just, the more you can lay out in the beginning before the conflict begins, the better able you're going to be to navigate that conflict. Because also, like, hey, this ain't our first rodeo. Like, how many times have we seen this happen? Like, oh, this is something that is in danger of happening if we don't make space for dealing with it first. So I would just say the more you can lay out before these things happen, the better. And then in terms of collaborating with others who are not from marginalized identities, like you can also like, I mean, it's almost an academic way, but it's a way that can work. It's like, what are we going to read so that we're on the same page? Like, do we both have the same understanding of how privilege works? Do we both have the same, like, where are we? Like, what's the prep work that we can do to make sure that we are taking care of each other in this collaboration?
Can I just add something to what you're saying?
Please,
yeah.
Please. No, I was just going to say facilitation. Get an outside facilitator, because this stuff is hard and it will touch your heart.
I'm somebody who started thinking intellectually in the 90s when it was all about identity politics in America. And I think it's really important to remember that where we are asking those questions, in front of what audience, with what cross-cultural dialogue this question is being addressed, completely shifts how it's done, right? So the way I felt like I had to tiptoe around the fact that my identity is multiple. I'm South Asian 1 minute, I'm a New Yorker 1 minute, I'm Muslim the next, and I'm also a woman, and I'm also a child of the Upper East Side. These things are, you know, conflicted and difficult. And in America, or in New York more specifically, it felt difficult. Here I am sitting in the UAE, where fluid identity is something that I have a different, allows me to have a different relationship. My family is from East Africa, from Tanzania. We belong to this Indian Ocean flow of culture historically. This is a very empowering thing to have understood by physically being in a place like the UAE and where it sits in the world, as opposed to the kind of, and in America, we all had a kind of notion that we're doing it the best possible way because we are in this country of free people, right? But it's a different thing. The sensitivities around identity were so much more difficult and anxiety provoking and conflict creating there than they were here. I'm not saying it's ideal here, but there are different roads that we can use for building these. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Oh, I really wish I could ask you all to go on and on and on. There is such a rich conversation happening. I also want to acknowledge what Karishma said in the chat about feedback. I think overall, what I've learned from this conversation and will continue to learn is just listening, creating space and intention. And when you fight with intention in every space and invite everyone and everything, I think that's when challenges start, but also collaboration happens. And with that, I'd like to end this talk. It has been so beautiful talking to you all. I think this is not the end, but more the beginning. Like Bill said, I'm so down to do a nightly talk show. But thank you so much for being here. And I will now give the space to Sebastian.
And from me also, such a big thank you to you all. And it's been such a pleasure witnessing and listening to your conversation and your thoughts. And it's been so inspiring. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Anushka for asking such thoughtful questions and keeping the conversation going in such an inspiring way. We have a number of really exciting events and workshops coming up. So at the Art Center, there is space for tomorrow for a workshop called Collaborative Life, which is a writing technique workshop that you can sign up for on the Art Center's website. And then on October 12th, you can attend Devising Our Way, an East African Perspective, which is a technique workshop. And then lastly, the next Arts Chat as part of the series will take place on October 25th. And it's centered around developing networks in the arts. And we're going to have really exciting speakers lined up for that as well. And again, all of those you can sign up for on the Art Center's website under the Events tab, or under the Art Gallery's website under the Events tab as well. And with that, again, big thank you to all of you on the panel. Thank you to Anushka. Thank you to the people who have been working really hard behind the scenes as well in making this happen. And I hope you have a wonderful evening, a wonderful afternoon, and a great day wherever you are joining us from. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again.